Good morning YouTube, my name's Sean Connors and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be continuing on our conversation about campaign design, and we're going to pick up where we left off last time, which was we left it at the point we talked about published settings, and we're going to talk about homegrown settings. But before we do, I think it's important to answer a question that was given to me by one of the YouTube subscribers, which is MMO Doubter, which is about to what degree do you plan your campaigns. I think what he's trying to ask here is about both camps, what degree do you plan. Well, obviously with the ad-lib stuff there is no beginning, middle and end. I think that's what you're referring to. But with the plan stuff, as a GM, yeah, you should absolutely be thinking beginning, middle and end. I always work personally from the end and then work backwards. I don't meticulously plan out how they get to the middle or how they get to the end. I do let those things organically happen, but I have a general overview of the campaign, the various arcs that are going to run, and some of the things that are going to happen. And then I'm quite adaptable, because if something's not really working, then I would prefer to change and then come up with something else that's going to get the players' blood going, rather than sit there with something that's not very good and very stale. So that's pretty much, I hope, answers your question. Now, today we're going to continue on with homegrown settings. For many GMs, to be perfectly honest with you, homegrown settings is the reason they got into GMing in the first place. The ability to create their own world and all the stuff that comes from that, the love, the passion. It becomes your child, you know, there's no doubt about that. But I think the key balancing factor when you're building homegrown settings is the balance between originality and accessibility. Naturally, one of the advantages to doing your own stuff is that your game, you can create adventures and encounters that are better suited to your taste, you know, and in a unique setting makes your game stand out. It's a little bit more memorable, and it puts your stamp on it. And I think that's again illustrates why so many GMs want to do it. However, there is a really big word of caution here. Now, as a very bad player, I use those words wisely, I think. I prefer to GM, as anybody knows who's ever watched my channel. Apologies for grabbing my tea. But when I do play, I'm often a disgruntled player. It's not that I'm difficult for the GM. In fact, I'm nothing but supportive and helpful. I know what it's like to be on the other side of the screen. I only want them to do well, you know. But when I see things, particularly homegrown settings, sometimes it just makes me think, oh, you know, really, did you have to do it that way? You know, couldn't you have tried something a little different? And what I'm trying to illustrate here is there's little point, to be honest, in filling binders full of notes if it's not original. Your setting has to stand out, yeah? That's the point of putting a setting together. It's got to be really good. But again, somebody might ask the question, rightly so, how far can I push the originality of my game? How far can I push it? And that is going to be completely down to your audience. This is why, you know, when you see people who will build a campaign and then go, right, I'm going to give it to this group. Yeah, don't know them from Adam, and run it. I wonder why it feels flat, the players are unexcited and all that. There are many reasons, but one of the primary reasons will be about, you know, the setting, the accessibility of it, the originality of it. Because, you know, you have to understand what your audience will cater for. Now, I've got multiple groups that I run games for. Now, I apologise to any more recent groups when I use these words, but for the main group, being the one in London that I've role-played with the longest, they're very conservative in their approach. And it's sometimes very difficult to push some concepts at them, whereas some of the more recent groups are much more adaptable and allow me a free rein as a GM to really go out there on a limb sometimes and really push the boundaries, which I'm very grateful for. So both camps I love, but in totally different ways. Now, I want to give you an example of a really far-out fantasy game that I put together a few years ago. I'm just going to quickly drink this, sorry. Still very sore throat from the other night of role-playing, to be honest. My far-out fantasy game was it was sort of a technologically primitive game, a tribal culture who lived in an incredibly hostile environment, haunted by nasty monsters and even more dangerous deities. The campaign was a great success because the key players in that group were open to something deeply peculiar, and I knew this, and heartily took on the different task of role-playing characters born and raised in a bizarre environment, no problem, and they were really into it. I'd never try to run this type of game with my main group because it just would not work. This is, you can see the more modern, the more up-to-date groups, the more recent campaign groups I've been a little bit more adaptable to the approach I want to take. I think probably because we haven't grown up together, and therefore people know that I want to run a campaign. I think the reputation of what I want to do precedes me, and therefore they're more adaptable to what I want to do. Whereas if you've known us for years and years and years, you want a certain type of game. We've known it together, and we run it together. I hope that makes sense. So that's sort of to try and illustrate one of the problems that you can have with homegrown settings. But you've got to look at your players' tastes and weigh that up, because if you go off on your own and you develop something before you've even sat down with your group, then you're just asking for a failure, really, and that's a shame and sad for all the effort and the work that he put in. Now, here at this point, I think we should bring in the very, very important word, tone. Now, of all the elements, and this is what I hark back to about originality in campaigns, and accessibility, but particularly originality. Tone is the thing that makes the players come back for more, or run for the hills, depending on what it is. Now, it really came in, as I said, role-playing design. That really came into role-playing design during the 90s with games like White Wolf's World of Darkness series, Deadlands, I suppose, Castle Frankenstein, D&D settings like Planescape, Dark Sun. They're all examples of tone. Some of my own games have had people say that they have a particular tone to them, which I totally understand. I think as well it's important to remember that every single one of us as GMs will equally run games in our own tone, which is quite an interesting concept, actually, when you think about it. So if we're really, let's think on this a little bit more. If we're really especially good at, we can evoke different tones of various genres. We can run spooky horror, fast and furious action, campy space opera, and so on. Even so, elements from our own personal styles will carry through from one campaign to the next. I think what you should do is take a few moments to consider your own GMing tastes and note them down in a few key words. How would you sum up the common emotional tone of your games? That could be a good video to do, actually, as a tag video. So if there's something that you could sum up your own games, that's probably one to think about. How would you do that? I would say that grim horror tends to crop into most of the games I run. First of all, it's tone that comes naturally to me. It arises from my worldview. Secondly, I tend to pit the pieces against threats that they can't overcome through a quick frontal assault. You have to think about things. They often end up feeling sometimes beleaguered, and a little comedy relief is useful, so I tend to throw that in quite readily. I guess none of us can really escape our own tonal habits, and that's the point, irrespective of the style of game or campaign that you wish to run or build. So it's important to think about it. I think one thing you can do, and I've learned a while back, one thing I've tried doing when we talk about tone is that you can change the pace when it comes to running a campaign or genre that's completely at odds with yourself. And a conscious way of doing this is literally to write down in the margin of every single bloody page, to be honest, the difference. So if it's going to be something where you don't want to do certain things ever again, write them in big letters and just make it clear what you're going to do. So for example, if you want to try and really create a spooky atmosphere, then everything you do has to be that little bit more descriptive, and you use those key words every time on every page so that it keeps you trying to focus on the tone of your game rather than lapsing back into what you're probably very good at. So I'd have a think about that in relationship to what you do, and you'll probably find that subconsciously, without really thinking about it, you have a tone as well in the way you do things. And that's funny enough, it's the same way that we do our YouTube videos. We all have a tone about doing them in a way that we want to do them. That comes in there, and probably people can glean in between the little bits and cameos that we do. They can actually glean a part of us as a GM. They probably sense it, to be honest. So that's probably the best way to describe it, and something to think about. I think as well what you can do is, another tip that you can use when we talk about how do I make something unique, is do a very simple thing. So if you want to try and create a unique homegrown setting, I personally wouldn't think too much about it. What I would do is just literally put out all the setting books, because I generally have them pretty close to hand. I have stack of stuff, as most of you have probably seen. I just literally randomly pull or get someone who doesn't know the RPG genre just to pick a couple of books and then just mismatch them together and see what comes. And so some good examples of that are where, more recently when I've been working out some campaign threads for the future, I've had things like I'm sort of doing things like the Roman Empire with in a D&D culture, but the Roman Empire being a much more sort of Pathfinder-based style of game, and the changes that would need to be in that to make it work, and imagining the world, and the Roman Empire being a much more darker empire and very different, being run by an iron simulacrum who has been left behind by its master and has continued his bidding, but in a much more Machiavellian, surreptitious way. Anyway, it's a long story, but that's just one of the examples that come, and it's quite a lot of fun to write for. Vampires in space, cyberpunk goes to war, swashbuckle investigates the occult. There's nothing that you can't splice and maybe make interesting if it suits what you want to do. So that's what I would suggest. It's a simple little thing, and do it a couple of times. If you're not happy with the result, do it 3 or 4 times. You're going to get something that makes it that really interests you, and you can really create a really fascinating homegrown setting if you've got any doubts on how to do it. It's the simplest way possible. Effectively, by finding the campaign's uniqueness in the joining of familiar elements, you're one step ahead when it comes to the following test. How easily can you condense the core concept of your campaign into a single word or sentence? So we're going to leave this video here for you to ponder on that, and we will pick back up in the third part of campaign design and the finishing part to it. I've been Sean Connors. This has been Campaign Design and The Outsider Show. Until the next time, take care of yourselves and happy gaming. Bye bye.